Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith is day 98. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 74 and 75 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of sin and of the causes of sin in general. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether the will can be the subject of sin. Subject in this context means something like cause or origin. Is the will a power which can sin? And it can, precisely because for sin to be sin, it must be voluntary. In a word from St. Thomas, the proper subject of sin must needs be the power, which is the principle of the act. Now, since it is proper to moral acts that they are voluntary, it follows that the will, which is the principle of voluntary acts, both of good acts and of evil acts or sins, is the principle of sins. Article 2, whether the will alone is the subject of sin. And although the will must be included, in order for us to be said to have sinned, it need not be the only power within which deficiency and privation can be found. For insofar as other powers can be commanded by the will or flow from the will, they can, like the will, fall short of some due order which is proper to them, and therefore be a subject of sin. In a sentence from St. Thomas, we do not sin except by the will as first mover, but we sin by the other powers as moved by the will. Article 3, whether there can be sin in the sensuality. And because the sensitive appetite, i.e. the passions, are shared between ourselves and irrational animals, and since irrational animals cannot sin, one might think that sin cannot be found in the sensitive appetite. But just like our passions have an aptitude to obey reason, they also have the capacity to follow the will when it is at variance with right reason, and thereby sin can be found in them. In Aquinas' words, sin may be found in any power whose act can be voluntary and inordinate, wherein consists the nature of sin. Now it is evident that the act of the sensuality or sensitive appetite is naturally inclined to be moved by the will, wherefore it follows that sin can be in the sensuality. Article 4, whether mortal sin can be in the sensuality. Let us first remember what makes a sin mortal or deadly to the spiritual life versus that which makes a sin only venial. A mortal sin is that in which the intended last end is disordered. Think of an act like idolatry or apostasy. These are perversions of our true goal, which is God. Venial sins are sins in which the ultimate end was right, but the proximate ends or means to this end were contrary to reason. Think of someone trying to correct his brother for his brother's salvation and the glory of God, but doing so in an inordinately angry or unjust way. As Aquinas puts it, in regard to this distinction between mortal and venial sins, when the soul is so disordered by sin as to turn away from its last end, vis-a-vis God, to whom it is united by charity, there is mortal sin. But when it is disordered without turning away from God, there is venial sin. So in response to our article, mortal sin must be in the higher faculties of man which dispose him to his last end, and so cannot be in sensuality, although sensuality can incline us to something which is mortally sinful. And a word from St. Thomas, now it belongs to the reason alone and not to the sensuality to order anything to the end, and disorder in respect of the end can only belong to the power whose function it is to order others to the end, wherefore mortal sin cannot be in the sensuality, but only in the reason. Article 5, whether sin can be in the reason. Sin is a kind of falling short, a missing the mark. So can reason fall short in its action and in a culpable way? And it can. St. Thomas says, first, insofar as it errs in the knowledge of truth, which error is imputed to the reason as a sin when it is in ignorance or error about what it is able and ought to have known. Secondly, when it either commands the inordinate movements of the lower powers or deliberately fails to check them. Article 6, whether the sin of morose delectation is in the reason. What does this term mean, morose delectation? Augustine says, deliberately holding and turning over what should have been cast aside as soon as it touched the mind. Lust and wrath are great examples of this. If a man is struck by the feeling of lust or the feeling of anger, he can either dismiss them, not entertain them, or can hold the corresponding thought which is eliciting them in the mind so as to take pleasure in it. So the spark of the feeling need not be sinful, but insofar as the disordered thought and its resulting pleasure is voluntarily held in the mind, then it can be called sinful. So the answer to our article is in the affirmative. The sin of morose delectation is in the reason. Article 7, whether the sin of consent to the act is in the higher reason. Consent is an act of the will, but follows upon the counsel or deliberation of the intellect, and so it involves both. So responding to our article, St. Thomas writes, consent is an act of the appetitive power, not absolutely, but in consequence of an act of reason, deliberating and judging. The fact that the consent is finally given to a thing is due to the fact that the will tends to that upon which the reason has already passed its judgment. Hence, consent may be ascribed both to the will and to the reason. Article 8, whether consent to delectation is a mortal sin. Is consent of the will to the delight elicited in some gravely disordered act a mortal sin? Well, our Lord said, as recorded in Matthew chapter 5, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So if delight results from the thought of adultery, and a man dismisses it, there is no sin. Also, if a man thinks about adultery merely for the sake of preaching against it or warning another person not to do it, then again, there's no sin. But if a man considers a specific act of adultery and then willfully consents in his heart to the delight which results from that thought, it is tantamount to delighting in the action itself, which, if grievously disordered, which adultery is a mortal sin. St. Thomas puts it this way: the fact that a man consents to such a delectation amounts to nothing less than a consent to the inclination of his appetite to fornication, for no man takes pleasure except in that which is in conformity with his appetite. Now, it is a mortal sin if a man deliberately chooses that his appetite be conformed to what is in itself a mortal sin. Wherefore, such a consent to delectation in a mortal sin is itself a mortal sin. Article 9, whether there can be venial sin in the higher reason as directing the lower powers. Insofar as a man does not consent to turning away from God or the eternal law, simply speaking, but rather consents to a disordered means to that end, like eating a little too much or speaking a little too much, then it can be said to sin venially. And so in response to our article, the higher reason can sin venially by directing the lower powers to that which is disordered but not in a mortally sinful way. Article 10, whether venial sin can be in the higher reason as such. When the mind consents deliberately to acts of the lower faculties, like adultery, which is in their kind a mortal sin, it sins mortally. But this question, the question of this article, is whether the mind can consent to entirely spiritual sins and in a way that is only venially sinful, not mortally sinful. Let us take unbelief, for example, because if a man sins directly against God by not believing him, that would be a mortal sin. But there is a way in which that same kind of sin, which is in its kind mortal, would only be venial. And St. Thomas explains that in an example. He says, "Now it is possible for one of the articles of faith to present itself to the reason suddenly, under some other aspect, before the eternal law or the law of God is consulted or can be consulted on the matter. As for instance, when a man suddenly apprehends the resurrection of the dead as impossible, naturally, and rejects it, as soon as he had thus apprehended it, before he has time to deliberate and consider that this is proposed to our belief in accordance with the divine law. If, however, the movement of unbelief remains after this deliberation, then it is a mortal sin." And with that, we move on to question 75 of the causes of sin in general. Article 1, whether sin has a cause, and it does, even if evil in itself is a privation, as we demonstrated in episode 25, and therefore has neither positive existence nor a positive cause for its existence, kind of like darkness in the room does not have actual existence or an actual cause, since it is simply a missingness, an absence of light. However, there must be a reason for this absence. When it comes to the nature of things, their subsequent actions, there must be a reason for why there is this absence of something which ought to have been present. And this is what we mean when we talk about sin having a cause. What is the explanation for this particular absence in right reason, making this action to be a sinful one? St. Thomas puts it this way: the will, lacking the direction of the rule of reason and of the divine law and intent on some mutable good, causes the act of sin directly, and the inordinateness of the act indirectly, and beside the intention. For the lack of order in the act results from the lack of direction in the will. So it is the lack of order which makes the act sinful, and that lack must have a cause for its missingness, which in the case of culpable sin must find some relation to the will. Article 2, whether sin has an internal cause, and a word from Aquinas which we will then explain. Accordingly, a double interior cause of sin may be assigned, one proximate on the part of the reason and will, and the other remote on the part of the imagination or sensitive appetite. What this means is that we derive knowledge from the senses, both exterior like sight as well as interior like the imagination. We are also influenced by our passions, the sensitive appetite, which result from sensitive apprehension. But the proximate or ultimate cause of our culpability, what makes sin possible, is the intellect and the will, which is capable of knowing the right order of things and voluntarily choosing it. Article 3, whether sin has an external cause. Only God can move the will directly as the first cause of all things, but external things can influence the will, the mind, for we receive knowledge from the senses, as we have said, also from our teachers, our role models. External things can also affect our passions. If there's a donut in the room, it may entice someone to eat it. But these external causes do not coerce us. Man remains free to eat or not eat any particular food. He remains free to ignore or disregard his teachers or the pursuit of true knowledge altogether. External causes can influence us, but the only cause of sin, which is able to be the sufficient and direct cause of our sin, is the will, our will. Article 4, whether one sin is a cause of another. And this is a very important article to reflect on personally and to take to personal prayer. And so I'm going to quote Aquinas at length here for the sake of our own reflection. He responds to this article in the following words: one sin may be the cause of another in respect of the four kinds of causes. First, after the manner of an efficient or moving cause, both directly and indirectly. Indirectly, as that which removes an impediment, is called an indirect cause of movement. For when man, by one sinful act, loses grace, or charity, or shame, or anything else that withdraws him from sin, he thereby falls into another sin, so that the first sin is the accidental cause of the second. Directly, as when by one sinful act man is disposed to commit more readily another like act, because acts cause dispositions and habits inclining to like acts. Secondly, after the manner of a material cause, one sin is the cause of another by preparing its matter. Thus, covetousness prepares the matter for strife, which is often about the wealth a man has amassed together. Thirdly, after the manner of a final cause, one sin causes another, insofar as a man commits one sin for the sake of another, which is his end, as when a man is guilty of simony for the end of ambition, or fornication for the purpose of theft. And since the end gives the form to moral matters, as stated already, it follows that one sin is also the formal cause of another, because in the act of fornication committed for the purpose of theft, the former is material while the latter is formal. So St. Thomas shows that in the manner of efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, and final cause, one sin can be the cause of another. And I think the one that we really need to reflect on most especially is what Aquinas called the indirect efficient cause of other sins. That when one loses charity, for example, by a mortal sin, he also removes a supernatural habit, the love of God, that protects him in many ways from other sins. So let us cleave closely to God and look to increase those virtues which keep us from falling or falling as easily into sin. We have just finished covering questions 74 and 75 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of sin and of the causes of sin in general. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.